So good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome to BGLU's first ever Power Forum. I'm pleased to be here and to host our great panel this evening. So I will start by telling you about BGLU, I will introduce our panel, and then we will start the discussion. So BGLU stands for British Ghanaian Lawyers Union, and our aim is to bridge the gap between legal professionals in the African diaspora and those on the continent. We're fighting for diversity, and we have put together this panel with leading lawyers to ask a pertinent question: are Black lawyers really included? So now, before we start our discussion, I'll introduce our great panel. So we have David Ampaw, who is partner at DLA Piper, specializing in restructuring and insolvency. David was named by Legal 500's individual for restructuring in 2017, 18, and 19. He was also a finalist for BSN's Lawyer of the Year in 2017 and 2018. He's also director of Prime Commitment, which is a non-profit organization specializing in accessing work experience to children from non-traditional backgrounds. Thank you, David, for being here. Great to have you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our second panelist is Michelle Danso, who is, as of yesterday, the head of the Prime Brokerage and Trading Legal team. No longer the co-head, so congratulations, Michelle.
Thank you.
Michelle is also chair of the Black Network at MAN. She also volunteers for Hillsong in New York City, and is also chair of BNCA, which is an organization which focuses on providing loans to immigrant communities in New York City. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Meena.
Thank you. And our third panelist is Kweku Aggrey-Orleans. Kweku is partner of Gaisie, Zwennes and Hughes and Company in Ghana, and also an English qualified barrister. Welcome, Kweku. Good to have you here. Okay.
Thank you very much.
No worries. So now that we've introduced our panel, we'll start the discussion. So why are we here? There is now a spotlight and a focus on diversity, given the Black Lives Matter movement and the various protests that have taken place around the world. So with that in mind, our first question to the panel is, do you think the BLM protests will cause real institutional change? And if so, what do you envisage that this change will be? And then can I pose that question to David, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, really good question. I mean, I think there's part of me that is the old man part of me that has seen a lot, I guess, and seen a lot in terms of incidents of racial injustice and or racial violence, going back as early as well in my lifetime, in my consciousness, in my teenage years, either in the States or the UK side in particular, and so there's part of me that has a little bit of skepticism, which is possibly healthy skepticism, and possibly not, around what we are seeing and experiencing now, and the ability of us all to change or move the dial based on the Black Lives Matter movement, and more generally movement to secure equality of opportunity. And that's what we're aiming for, I think, a fair shot, just like any other group. So I don't know whether this is for corporate UK, corporate America, or the like, a moment. I hope not. I hope that this is a movement. But I have seen a lot in the past, and I've seen a lot in people's reactions in the short term around things like black squares and or corporate, very on message corporate messaging, which is already easy to do. It's actually easy to give money as well. Already easy, really easy things to do. But actually, what about the micro changes that then spawn organizational change? And or show me your boardroom now and show me your boardroom 5 years ago and show me it in 10 years time. That will be the measure. And I think the hardest part really is the micro changes, the organizational kind of micro changes and changes to people's day-to-day interactions with Black lawyers and, or in fact, any minority lawyers within organizations. So in short answer to your question, I think BLM has the capacity to help change, I think, the narrative. But the real test will come beyond BLM and into the DNA, or whether there will be a change in the DNA of organizations. If we're talking about law firms in particular, in the DNA of organizations like law firms, to make a diverse and inclusive workforce a real priority for them in the future. Not just a priority because clients think it matter, but actually something that, and that is an element, but something that matters as part of being a lawyer and as part of social justice.
Thank you, David. Would anyone else on the panel like to take that question? Perhaps Michelle?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in, and I can come from the non-law firm angle, sort of corporate in-house. So I can just give the man experience. So what we saw happen, especially sort of started out here in New York with all the protests and joining a few of them with the fear of coronavirus, but I still sort of put my mask on and went out. What we saw was, I've seen possibly greater engagement internally in my company, but it took some spearheading. So we had to, few of us had to write pretty deep emotional emails right to the very senior, sort of the CEO level, and be like, you guys see what's going on? Like, the complete silence isn't acceptable as a company. We're not asking that you make a public statement, but even a statement internally to people of what's going on. So it's kind of started at that level of conversation, and then it opened up more to allyship. And now you have sort of, we're trying to hold the company accountable for things, for example, where are we recruiting from, which recruiting firms that we use, and microaggression training. These are, I feel like it's opened doors for conversations that historically some places would have been difficult to have. So now it's like they're kind of forced to address it. They can't really hide. So on that level, I have some hope that there's some, my firm has been around since the 1800s. Man is old school. It started of like delivering rum to the British Army. So for Man Group, when I joined almost 11 years ago, you could count how many Black people were there in one hand. We're probably up to 60 now, but we need to do better. So the fact that we now have a bit of a seat at the table where we can have some very challenging conversations with very senior people, and it's not always, to be honest, I've had some conversations and gone to bed with like my heart sinking, thinking, oh God, what's the morning going to look like? But the fact that we can have these conversations with our CEOs and COOs. So in some organizations, I do think, and talking to peers at Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, a few others, they're having similar conversations with their senior guys. And I think a firm like BlackRock gave a pretty firm statement about how they want to increase their numbers, and not just, usually when they say they want to increase numbers, it's at graduate level. It's never at the senior level where decisions are made. So one of the things we've been challenging Mano is, you keep saying all that, we keep doing all these things to bring in graduates, but it's senior exco that makes the decision. So what are we doing for the pipeline for that? So I feel like I have some hope in my little world, because we've had opportunities to have conversations that I've never seen happen in my 11 years at the firm. So for that, I have some hope, but I do get where David's coming from. I have a lot of friends who are just like, this is just another loud thing. It's gonna die down when people's lives return to normal and the coronavirus is done and people are out again. You see that people aren't as engaged. And you've seen that a bit in New York. The protests have gone down, the postings, the hashtags have sort of like, because things are open up again. So people's attentions have moved on. But I'm hopeful that we can make some change in our little world.
Thank you, Michelle. And Kweku, would you like to add to that as well? Wait, Kweku?
My thunder has been stolen by David. Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Hello?
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Just asking, Kweku, do you want to add to that as well?
Indeed, I was saying that my thunder had been stolen by David in the sense that I too am skeptical, but the devil's going to be in the detail. I think it's really important that we drill down on what the scope of the problem is. And whilst we seek to restrict this to the legal sector and Black people within the legal sector, and I'm going to confine it to my area of knowledge, which would be in England and Wales, really. There are overall issues that confront the Black community that, of course, we are part of. And it's interesting when it comes to approaching the question as to whether or not there is hope in this BLM movement, is to look at what we've had in the past, particularly in the United Kingdom. So you've had the McPherson report, okay, which came and went. There seems really, because we keep going on about it, and it then led to the Lammy review, there seemed to have been some changes, but they weren't significant enough. We then have gone on to have the 2017 David Lammy review on the impact and looking really at the question of ethnicity. And what the findings he makes are pretty harrowing. At the time, I think we were dealing with a population, but he deals with Black, Asian, and minority and ethnic. So BAME as opposed to a focus on Black, which this discussion's about. But he finds that men and women, Black men and women, albeit making up 14% of the population, were 25% of the prisoners, whilst over 40% of the young people in custody. And of course, this I'm not minded to simply draw from the statistics about criminals, which buys into this sort of stereotype that, oh, every Black person must have been through the criminal system. It's not, but we can't dodge the impact that has on us in terms of perception. Then we've had the Equality and Human Rights Commission, again in 2017, analyzing the question of ethnicity and the pay gap. And the findings there are not so straightforward. There are findings, certainly in relation to Black men, that in all cases and all ages, that we lag behind white men. And I think that was assessed based on the hourly rate. What's interesting is that Black women seem to fare better than white women in terms of the equality pay at some levels. And in fact, you have those who suffer most in the equality pay gap are in fact Pakistani and Bangladeshi, and not in fact Blacks. I mentioned that just for us to move away from the sort of single story type line. But nevertheless, what's marked, and this is something that was referred to when David talks about who's in your boardroom, when David talks about, well, let's look through and see what cases are your Black lawyers dealing with. Do they have fair access to all the opportunities that are coming in? Is a significant finding that over the age of 30, Black men then really begun to lag behind more significantly than white men, as opposed to at a younger age. I can understand that. And then also in relation to Black men with qualifications, particularly. So this whole sort of argument is, oh, well, you know, get yourself a good degree and you're going to be fine, seems to fail when put up with the statistic, which shows that in fact, Black men were lagging not only behind white colleagues with equal qualifications, but even could lag behind whites who were less qualified than them. And that buys into, I think, what we know famously from the United States, that where the statistics seem to show that white men without college degrees earned more than Black men. On to some issues with the Black community in terms of discrepancies as against whites, and these figures, Black against white, which I think is a focus. And you've got things like childbirth, for example. Black mothers 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy as measured in between 2014 and 2016 than white mothers. Life expectancy, so Black people lower life expectancy. Mental health, Black people are more than 3 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. Education, they don't. It's been assessed that they don't have the same life chances as the rest of the population. White students aged between 16 and 18 are twice as likely as their fellow black students to achieve 3 pupils were twice as likely to be excluded than white Caribbean pupils. There's a lag behind in terms of the number of the black community who were employed as against the white community, which was stark. I've discussed the difference in earnings. And even in London, ethnic minorities, again, these statistics are very much focused on BAME, where I got these from, but it's a startling statistic that ethnic minorities earn 21.7 less than the rest of the population. And in that same year, 2018, 1.9 million black and ethnic minority workers were paid about 3.2 billion less than their white counterparts. Homelessness is also a problem for black people, who are much more likely to be homeless than white people. Victims of crime, black Caribbeans, I believe, to be 50% more likely to be a victim of crime as opposed to white people. Police stop and search, arrests, prisons, deaths in custody. So that's the backdrop that we come to this problem with, because ultimately, whether we like it or not, it begins to affect us. And so when the question's asked, doubling back to, do you think the Black Lives Matter protest will have a real institutional change on diversity? The devil's in the detail, and I'm going to contribute as much as I can to the debate, but nevertheless, I am skeptical. I make this last point, which is a general point, that, look, this is a really complex situation, and it's not a simple story. And as glad as I am to sit on this panel, in the same way as when dealing with any case, I'd go to an expert. There are experts, there are voices around who've studied the Black community, who've studied the discrepancies, the lack of access to opportunity suffered in the Black community, which itself is not a homogenous group. And they should be called upon and looked to providing solutions, as opposed to, I would say, despite the contributions I can make, someone like myself, who is a Ghanaian barrister and partner in a Ghanaian law firm, but that doesn't qualify me for anything. I might have had my own personal experiences, but that's not enough. If we are going to have real change, the real change has to be meaningful, and it has to be done by people who know what they're talking about, not lawyers part-time doubling as socioeconomic experts. And I think that's really important. So when it comes to questions as to what should be done, it's not going to be enough just to pull up who's that lady, Candace, whatever her name is, who is saying, well, no, actually no racism to see here. And then you pull up someone else who says, oh yeah, lots of racism to be seen here. That's not how it's going to work. For it to be really meaningful, what we need to have are the experts on point, crunching these. In relation to bar, it's very clear from the Barson's figures that they're not detailed, because questions of ethnicity are questions that you don't have to answer. So found that about 13.9% of barristers didn't answer the question as to their ethnicity. Now that has an impact on an assessment of the penetration. And my skepticism is also somewhat supported by what I've heard from Boris Johnson, which is nothing to look at here. Everything's fine, don't try and erase our history.
Thank you very much, Kweku. And following on from that, we'll talk about the label BAME. So for those outside of the UK who may not be familiar with this label, it refers to Black, Asian, and other minority ethnicities. Now, this label is normally used to provide statistics on diversity. So a question to the panel: do you think the BAME label is helpful in identifying the issues experienced by Black professionals? And I would like to pose that to David, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, I you know, a lot of what Kweku says absolutely resonates because, you know, and with respect to this question, in that, you know, there is no one homogenous Black community, and I think to put people under the label of BAME, I think, you know, doesn't do justice to their individual experiences. So, you know, to lump the experiences of a UK-born, UK Bangladeshi man with a Black woman under the kind of BAME category, and let alone if we examine things like social mobility, which I think is possibly in the UK the biggest factor around access to opportunity, as contrasted with the States, where I think race is much more of an issue. And I think, you know, the BAME categorization isn't necessarily that helpful at all, because there are the issues here are super complex, and actually, as I say, the experiences of the components that make up BAME will be completely different. The representation if we're talking about law firms, is completely different. If we're talking about, even if we're talking about use a Bangladeshi man or a Black woman, as opposed to a Chinese Asian man, right? You know, and that's without even digging down into, again, socioeconomics, educational background, etc., etc. So these are really complex issues around kind of intersectionality of characteristics, which mean that a sort of a wholesome categorization under one particular label isn't necessarily helpful to think to distilling the issues and the possible solutions. But I can see why it is attractive in order to provide a vehicle for a debate. In that, unfortunately, we all know that, and we all know this from looking at the machinations of the UK government at the moment, that if you try and get too complicated until too subtle, which might be the right way, then you lose people. They will just not engage in the debate for a whole bundle of reasons. So my summation is that I don't necessarily think BAME is a helpful label. I think you need to look at groups to the extent you can, but individuals' characteristics, which makes the whole discussion much more difficult, but it just means you can tailor your suggestions or solutions in a way that is sensitive to those persons' characteristics.
Thank you, David. I should at this point say to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit your questions using the chat function, and we will try our best to go through those questions at the end. Okay, thank you. So with that in mind, has anyone on the panel experienced a time where they haven't felt included or they felt discriminated against? And if so, how did they react? So Michelle, would you be able to answer that question for us, please?
That's a good question. I think there was a long time ago training contracts, just sort of to bring it into context for the group, training contract interviews in London, I think maybe 2005, 6, and there was a law firm that I had an interview with, and I can't remember the exact word he used, but I think when I called for feedback when I didn't get through, just to sort of understand about the process and everything, and the guy made a comment about I wasn't the right fit for the firm. And I mean, back then sometimes you sort of let it brush off, but the older I've gotten, it's like, well, what do you mean I wasn't the right fit? And it was a very English firm. So growing now, I'm like, okay, does it mean I'm not white, I'm not from an Oxbridge background, I'm not this? So now I'm older, now I think about it. That's the one key example I can say that made, like, when you think about it more, it's like, wow, I'm not a right fit, like, I'm Black and female, is that what you mean? I don't like to think about things that way. I always like to sort of, during my career, and I always think about, okay, I'm here, I don't want people to think I'm here because I tick a box, because I'm Black and I'm female, I'd like to not think like that. But there have been instances where you do think, gosh, is that in people's mind? Are people seeing you as being at the table because they think you're there to tick a box, not because you actually belong there. So yeah, that's the one instance that I can point to.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And would anyone else on the panel like to also answer that question?
Well, I can say from my part in chambers, I mean, I've got no evidence of being discriminated against in terms of distribution of work, et cetera, et cetera. However, the adjunct to that, of course, as a barrister, you're going off to court, you're there to represent people, and you see reactions. I remember my first occasion when I did my first case, first time on my feet as a pupil barrister, decked out in my black pinstripe suit, Eden Ravenscroft. My dad had bought me overcoat, briefcase, you know, the usual stuff when a bit too keen when you start. Going to a criminal court where I was defending a white heroin addict wife beater. And as soon as I came into the court and I approached the clerk immediately asked me if I was the white heroin addict wife beater, immediately assuming that I couldn't have been the lawyer or the barrister in charge. And I mean, that to me is a sort of crystal clear indication of not being the fit he expected, because with all modesty in the world that I have or may not have, if white equivalently looking barrister in pinstripe suit had come up to the clerk, there's no question that that clerk would have thought that he was in fact a barrister, if not a QC. So what's good for the goose is not good for the gander in that regard. And I know of plenty of other incidents where within the court process, black lawyers, black law students have had short shrift as opposed to white students. A marked example of that came from, in fact, someone who's on the same site as this august group, who talks about wanting to go and get some work experience in the Old Bailey, so simply by going in and watching a trial. It gets to lunchtime, everyone goes, the defendant, who happens to be black, also goes for his lunch, comes back. The law student, also black, comes back after lunch, heads up to the public gallery. I don't know, for those of you who don't know the Old Bailey, obviously the public gallery is up on high and overlooks the court. Only for him all of a sudden to be shouted at by the judge, who was saying, you know, what on earth are you doing, you defendant, up there? You should be here in court. By the way, you're late. And it took a couple of moments before the clerk sort of quietly told the judge, well, no, that's not him. Okay, so there appears in this system an inherent danger, in fact, even if you're a black student going into a criminal court, because you might end up in the dock. And things like that are outrageous. And so with that in mind, I mean, it's very clear that it's not about personal experiences. We know these experiences are going on. It's about finding meaningful solutions. And in fact, finding a buy-in. Because I do start and end all discussions on discrimination by saying two things. You're worse off if you're not pulling on your whole talent pool, okay? The black community forms a massive part of that talent pool. That's one. And the second one is that racism is actually not a black person's problem. I know we suffer the consequences of it, but actually, if you're in an organization and you are discriminatory